For the first time in years, I had let myself believe this wedding could be mine alone, a day not overshadowed by Brianna. That hope was still warm inside me when I opened my parents' front door and stepped into the hallway. I had left work early and thought I would surprise them, maybe share the news that a florist I liked had agreed to hold a date for us. As I moved toward the dining room, I noticed the door was not closed all the way. It was open just enough for voices to slip through, and I slowed without thinking. Brianna's voice carried out first, bright and sharp. She said I would pay for everything just like before, because that is what little sisters are for. My mother laughed pleased, and added that they had already told everyone about the combined celebration. My father's voice followed deep and steady, saying a 5-year anniversary deserves as much attention as a wedding. My body went cold. I stood still, my palm pressed flat to the wall. The bridal magazine I was carrying sliding from my fingers to the carpet without a sound. My cheeks burned and my chest tightened as their voices went on with easy cheer, making plans with my name and my savings, as if I were a silent partner who could not possibly object. In that moment, a memory rose so fast, it felt like I had been pulled backward through time. I was 10 again, standing in our living room, as Brianna opened the gifts, wrapped in bright paper with my name on them. My parents praised her for being a generous sharer, while I folded my hands and tried to smile. Then, I was 20, standing in my father's study, as he rested his heavy hand on my shoulder and asked me to help because family comes first. I remember the weight of that choice when I agreed to hand over my entire savings, $15,000 I had worked for and planned to use for school. I remember dropping classes, taking shifts falling behind, while Brianna walked down an aisle in a dress that cost more than my car. I remember telling myself that night as the band played and the lights spun across the floor, never again. Now, years later, standing in the hallway of that same house, hearing their voices, I felt that promise tremble like a fragile line stretched too thin. Slowly, I stepped back, careful not to let the floor creak. I slipped outside and crossed to my car, sank into the driver's seat and stared at nothing. The keys dangled in my hand, but I could not turn them. I could still hear Brianna's words in my head, my mother's laugh, my father's approval, all of them weaving me into their plans before I had even been asked. My chest tightened with the familiar panic, the old fear of saying no, the weight of what it would mean to stand against them. Yet, beneath the fear, another voice pressed forward, quiet but steady. Never again. I repeated it inside myself, not as the echo of an old vow, but as something new, something heavier and stronger. I reached for my phone and scrolled to Ethan's name, hesitated, then pressed call. When he answered, I told him I had come home early and heard something that shook me. I told him I needed a plan, not permission. He said we would talk tonight, that we would take it one step at a time, and that whatever they were planning, I would not face it alone. His calm voice steadied me. I ended the call and sat with the quiet hum of the car around me, breathing slowly until my chest loosened. I picked up the magazine from the floor and smoothed its bent pages. My eyes caught on the picture of a simple white dress, the kind without beading or heavy fabric, the kind that would not weigh me down. I thought of the little girl who had been told to smile while her sister opened her presents, and the young woman who signed away her education fund. I thought of the woman I was now 30 years old, engaged to someone who spoke to me with respect, who looked at me as if I were worth protecting. For the first time, I let myself believe that I could hold the line, that I could choose something different. As the laughter drifted faintly from behind the cracked door, I knew my promise would be tested harder than ever before. But I also knew that this time I was ready to fight for it. That thought was still in me 2 nights later, when Ethan and I walked up the familiar path to my parents' house. The porch light glowed warmly, but in my stomach there was only a cold twist of nerves. I already guessed what was waiting. My mother had called it a casual family dinner, yet when she opened the door, I saw the table behind her gleaming with the good, china-polished silver crystal glasses, set carefully in rows. That table never appeared unless something was about to be declared. We sat down, my parents at either end, Brianna across from me, Ethan steady at my side. Conversation was light at first, talk about the weather, about Ethan's work, about how quickly the summer was passing. But the cheer in my mother's tone was too rehearsed, her eyes too bright, and before the chicken was even served, she folded her hands and announced it. She said they had the most brilliant idea, and her smile widened with pride as she looked at each of us. She said we would combine my wedding with Brianna and Derek's 5th anniversary. My father nodded, as if it were a matter already decided, speaking of family unity and how practical it would be. Brianna leaned forward, her excitement so sharp it filled the room, and pulled a thick folder from her bag. She opened it like a teacher, presenting a lesson tabs marked in bright colours, lists neatly typed. She spoke of flowers ordered to match her original bouquets, of 2 cakes designed to coordinate, of colours chosen for continuity with her wedding 5 years ago. She even had notes about a special dance to honour her marriage. Each detail tied back to her celebration, each page centred her story. I listened, my hand resting under the table until Ethan's fingers closed over mine, firm and reassuring. Then, Brianna slid a guest list across to me. I expected a balance, maybe even generosity. But as I scanned down the pages, my heart sank. Row after row carried her friends, her colleagues, her old sorority sisters' names from her world. My world was barely there at all, just a handful of people tucked in the margins. My cheeks grew hot as I realised what this truly was. I was not a bride at this table. I was a shadow invited to fund another encore for my sister. My mother's eyes settled on me, full of expectation. My father leaned back, ready to nod at whatever I said. Brianna waited, her smile stretched wide, certain she would hear my usual automatic yes. For a moment, I felt the years pressing down again, all those times when I agreed without pause, when I gave away what was mine before I had even spoken. The silence swelled. I breathed in slowly and felt Ethan's hand tighten, reminding me I could choose something different. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet, but steady enough. I said, "Let me think about it." The words hung there heavier than I imagined. The clink of forks stopped. My mother's smile froze. My father blinked as if confused. Brianna's lips parted, then closed again without sound. The table, so carefully arranged, suddenly felt fragile. And in that silence, I felt something inside me shift. For the first time in years, I had not given them what they expected. I lowered my eyes to the guest list still in my hand. My name was on the cover, but the celebration inside belonged to someone else. I folded the pages, slowly slid them back across the table, and kept my gaze calm. For the first time, I was not their obedient daughter, not the convenient sister. I was the bride of my own story. That thought stayed with me like a steady hum as I left the dinner and drove home with Ethan. It gave me strength, but it also left me restless. I lay awake that night, listening to his breathing beside me, turning over each detail of the evening, the folder Brianna had opened, the guest list, heavy with names I did not know, the way my parents had waited for my yes, as if nothing else was possible. The promise I had made to myself felt strong, but questions kept circling. How far had they already gone without me, and what else had they decided in my name? By morning, I knew I would not be able to rest until I saw for myself. Later that day, I told Ethan I needed to stop by my parents' house to pick something up. He offered to come, but I shook my head. I needed space to think, and part of me knew I would have to move quietly. The house was empty when I arrived. My father's study smelled faintly of coffee and leather, the curtains half drawn. I sat down at his desk and pressed the power button on the computer. The glow of the screen filled the dim room, and for a moment I hesitated, my hand hovering over the mouse. Then I opened his email. My breath caught as I read thread after thread with vendors. Deposits discussed, contracts drafted, and in every message one promise repeated. Do not worry, Grace will pay once contracts are signed. My name written again and again as if it were a guarantee. My chest tightened, my hands cold on the keyboard. I clicked on a file marked W+A budget final. Spreadsheets opened tabs in neat rows, numbers stacked in black and red. Venue, 22,000. Catering, 15. Entertainment flowers, photography dresses. At the bottom, a sum stared back at me. 63,000. And beneath it, typed in purple letters, I recognised as Brianna's touch, Grace's responsibility. I leaned back in the chair, dizzy, staring at the ceiling, as if it might hold steadier ground than the screen before me. This was no longer about assumptions or family pressure. This was written proof that they had built the whole event on my shoulders. A notification blinked in the corner of the screen. My mother's tablet was still logged in. Without thinking, I clicked. An order confirmation appeared, bright and clean. A bridal gown, not mine, purchased 3 days ago with my credit card number. I stared at the digits, the same ones I had given my mother months earlier when she asked to order something small for me. I felt sick. She had handed it to Brianna. My throat burned and I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles ached. They had not only spoken in my name, they had stolen from me outright. I closed the window and noticed another file on the desktop. A PowerPoint, its title sharp in black letters. 5th anniversary, Brianna and Derek, hosted by Grace. I opened it and flipped through slides filled with pictures of venues, menus, and seating charts. Every page celebrated their anniversary. My wedding was a side note, a convenient excuse for the grandeur. In those slides, I barely existed. My role was to provide a name and a checkbook. My heart pounded in my ears as I shut the file. On the way out of the study, I paused by the front door. A small stack of mail rested on the table. I picked up an envelope with my name but no return address. Inside were copies of receipts, golf club fees, spa weekends, travel bookings. At the bottom, a short note read, "Thought you should know." The handwriting was plain, but I knew who had sent it. Derek. For the first time, I saw not only my betrayal, but a crack in theirs. Even her husband was questioning the story. I drove home in silence, the envelope resting on the seat beside me. The road blurred as I whispered to myself, they did not just plan without me. They stole from me. They erased me. The fear that had haunted me for so long burned into something sharper. Anger. For the first time, it felt clean, not wild or out of control, but steady and sure. They had used my money, my name, even my place in my own wedding, and I would not let them own me anymore. The glow of that screen had stripped away every illusion. My family had crossed from manipulation into theft, and I would not stay quiet. This time, I would fight with evidence, not tears. She said, "Your father's heart is weak, darling. He cannot take stress. Do not push him into another episode. Please do not add more weight to his chest." The words hit me like a hook. For a moment I was 10 again, terrified of doing anything wrong. I held the phone so tight my fingers hurt, but I stayed silent while she went on about doctors' blood pressure and how keeping the peace would be the best medicine. I almost believed her until Ethan touched my shoulder and shook his head. When I hung up, he said, quietly, "That was not concern, that was control." I knew he was right, but the guilt clung like smoke. I thought that call was the worst of it, but by afternoon Brianna's name lit up my screen. She began sweetly, almost cheerful. She reminded me of the day she introduced me to the manager who had later hired me, and how grateful I should be for her connections. Then Her voice sharpened as she said, "You would not even have that career if it were not for me. Do not be selfish now." I sat at my desk, staring at the wall, my throat tight. Every syllable dripped with the same old message. I owed her everything. I forced myself to say, "Only I have to go," and ended the call before she could say more. My hands shook, but under the tremor was anger. They were changing tactics, pulling on every thread they thought would unravel me. 2 days later, I went to the boutique with Jessica, hoping for a sliver of peace. I slipped into a simple ivory gown, the kind I had always pictured clean and light. For a few minutes, I turned before the mirror, feeling almost like a bride again, not a sponsor, not a shadow. Then, the bell above the door rang, and I saw Brianna sweep in, with my mother trailing behind. Their timing was no accident. My mother clapped her hands as if delighted by a surprise. Brianna circled me, her eyes sharp. She said, "It is a bit plain, not like my Vera Wang, but I suppose it suits you." I bit my lip and turned back to the mirror, determined not to answer. She reached for a glass of red cocktail from a tray by the counter, and before I could move, she stumbled just enough for the liquid to spill across the front of my dress. The red spread fast across the ivory fabric, blooming like a wound. The glass shattered on the floor. Brianna gasped her hand to her mouth in mock horror. She said, "Oh no, how clumsy of me, thank goodness you had not bought it yet." The boutique owner rushed with soda water, but the gown was ruined. I stood there trembling, my fists tight at my sides. My mother patted my arm gently and said, "Do not worry, dear. We will find something that complements Brianna's anniversary dress." My chest burned and I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, to throw the ruined fabric back at them, to let out years of swallowed anger. But I did not. I looked at Jessica's eyes, steady with outrage, and I knew she saw through it all. I forced myself to nod, to walk away without a word. That night at home, I sat in the bathroom staring at my reflection. My eyes were red but dry. The tears were there, but I refused to let them fall. I whispered to myself, "Not tears strategy." I thought of my mother's call, of Brianna's voice dripping with sweetness and poison, of the ruined gown lying crumpled in a shop bin. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to collapse so they could step in and call it proof that I was not strong enough to stand alone. But I would not give them that gift. I pressed my palms to the sink, leaned closer to the mirror and said out loud, "This will not be decided by their tricks. This time it will be decided by me." Ethan knocked lightly on the door, his voice soft. "Are you all right?" I opened the door, my face set. I said, "I am done crying. Now I plan." He nodded as if he had been waiting to hear those words and pulled me into his arms. The weight of my frustration slowly steadied into resolve. They had tried guilt. They had tried threats. They had even tried to destroy the symbol of my joy. But all they had done was sharpen my edge. If they thought I would bow to their shield of family, they had forgotten that I was part of that family too, and I knew exactly how it worked. The trap at Rosewood was meant to cage me, but all it did was teach me how to fight from inside the walls. That truth pressed against my chest as Ethan and I pulled up to the tall gates of Rosewood Manor the following weekend. The place looked like something out of a glossy magazine, all shining windows and manicured lawns, chandeliers glittering through the glass. My father clapped the manager on the shoulder the moment we stepped inside as if they were old friends. My mother smoothed her blouse, her smile fixed and bright, and Brianna walked a few steps ahead, her heels clicking on the marble floor like she already owned it. I tried to steady myself as we entered the grand ballroom. The ceiling soared high, the tables were set in a wide circle, and the windows opened onto sweeping gardens. It was beautiful, but the kind of beauty that suffocates. My father spread his arms and said proudly, 200 guests will fit here easily." My heart dropped. We had planned for 50. My mother waved away my shock with a laugh. Everyone has already been notified, she said. The manager, Mr. Phillips, stepped forward, holding a thick folder. He said all we needed today were signatures and a deposit, and everything would be set. My mother's eyes shone. Brianna leaned across the table, her voice smooth, saying, "This is perfect. Grace, you cannot back out. Now everyone is counting on you." I felt Ethan's hand close around mine, steadying me, and before my father could put pen to paper, I spoke. I said my fiancé and I agreed that both of our signatures are required on any contract. That is non-negotiable. The words landed like stones in a still pond. My father blinked at me confused. My mother's smile faltered. Brianna gave a sharp laugh and said, "Since when do you make decisions at all?" I repeated myself, calm, my voice stronger this time. "This is our wedding, both signatures or nothing." Ethan nodded beside me, silent but firm, his presence like a wall at my back. The manager cleared his throat, trying to regain control, and slid the contract toward me again. I could feel every eye on me waiting, pressing. Slowly, I took my card from my purse and placed it on the table. "I will pay $6,000 for the deposit," I said clearly. "That is my only contribution. The rest is not my responsibility." My parents exchanged a glance, unease flickering in their eyes. Brianna's lips parted, but before she could object, I pulled a folder from my bag and laid it flat. Inside were printed credit card statements, showing the gown purchased on my account vendor emails, promising that Grace will pay, and a spreadsheet with $63,000 written across the bottom in bold purple letters. I slid the pages across the polished table. My father's face drained of colour as he stared. My mother would not meet my eyes. Brianna's voice rose too quickly, saying, "This is nothing, this is being dramatic," but the tightness in her jaw betrayed her. I leaned back in my chair, my voice even. These charges were not mine. These promises were not mine. This deposit is my limit. Nothing more. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the chandeliers. The manager shuffled the papers awkwardly, clearing his throat again. My father muttered something about misunderstandings. My mother tried to smooth it over. Brianna rolled her eyes, but I had made my line clear. I stood taking Ethan's hand, and we walked toward the door. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father linger, bending toward Mr. Phillips in a low voice. I could not hear the words, but later I learned the truth. My father had signed a side deal, promising that if I ended up covering the full bill, he would receive a private discount kickback. That knowledge burned in me, not as fear, but as fuel. In the car, I stared out at the rolling lawns of rosewood, the manicured trees that looked so perfect and false. I said to Ethan, I gave them my limit. They crossed it, once they will try again. But this time, I am ready. He squeezed my hand, his eyes steady on the road. I leaned back, the weight heavy but clear. They had built a trap for me here, but I had walked out of it on my own terms. They could plot in shadows, but I would not bend. In the mirror, I no longer saw their obedient daughter or the perfect sister. I saw myself at last, ready to fight in both shadows and light. That certainty carried me through the days that followed, though my family's pressure did not ease. If anything, the silence between us only grew heavier, like a storm waiting to break. I knew I had to move quickly, not only to protect myself, but to create a path forward that belonged to me and Ethan alone. Maya was the first to bring hope. One afternoon, she met me at a cafe, her face bright with excitement. She slid her phone across the table to show me photos of a small chapel tucked beside a lake, white wooden beams glowing in the sun. It was available the weekend before the Rosewood event. She said she could secure it within days, and Ethan's parents had already offered their lake house for a reception. As she spoke, I felt warmth in my chest, a picture forming of vows spoken without an audience of strangers, laughter shared with people who loved us without conditions. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to smile, not because someone expected it, but because I wanted to. Still, joy alone was not enough. I needed evidence. That weekend, I slipped a small recorder into my purse before going to dinner at my parents' house. I felt guilty as I pressed the button, but the guilt faded when I heard my mother say, "She will come around, she always does." My father added, "Grace will pay, that is settled." Their voices, calm and certain, were captured without them knowing. Later, listening back in my apartment, I felt sick at the casual way they used me. Yet beneath the sickness was vindication. Now their words were no longer only memories in my head. They were proof. Ethan's sister Sarah, with her calm lawyer's mind, sat me down the next day. She told me to change every PIN number, every password, to block the doors they had already walked through. She advised me to file a credit card dispute about the dress Brianna had ordered, warning me it would not be solved overnight, that it would trigger an investigation instead. Her steady voice was like water on fire, cooling the panic that had lived in me for weeks. For once, I felt I had allies who did not want to use me only to see me safe. That night, standing in front of my bathroom mirror, I thought about all the years my mother had insisted that my long, straight hair was the most flattering. She said it made me look respectable, polished the daughter she wanted to present. I lifted a pair of scissors, my hand trembling at first, then steadying as I took the first lock between my fingers. The sound of the blades cutting was sharp, final. Strand after strand fell into the sink, dark against white porcelain. Ethan stood in the doorway, silent, watching with a look that was not shock, but pride. When I was done, I touched the uneven ends, lighter, freer. I whispered to my reflection, "This is me, not their version of me." The face staring back was mine alone. Ethan stepped forward, resting his hands on my shoulders. He said softly, "I have never seen you look stronger." I believed him. For the first time in years, I felt unshackled. The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled me. It had become fuel, pushing me to plan to fight to step into the light with my own voice. That night, as we sat on the floor, surrounded by notes, receipts, and timelines, I felt something shift. I was not only defending myself anymore, I was preparing to win. The mirrors that had once shown me only what my family wanted me to be were gone. What remained was me ready to stand, ready to choose, ready to fight in both shadows and light. While they fumed in a ballroom built on lies, I stood in the quiet truth of the lake house, knowing the stage they had set would collapse without me. That thought steadied my hands as I tied my robe and reached for my phone. The morning light spilled across the kitchen table where Maya had laid out a small spread of fruit and tea, and Ethan's parents moved in and out with an easy kindness that made the house feel safe. I lifted the phone, angled the camera, and took a simple selfie in the robe, my short hair tucked behind my ear, my smile calm but real. I typed a cheerful line to the family group, running a little behind, but so excited, and hit send. The reply came almost at once. My mother's voice made of text, "Everyone is arriving, your father is greeting the Hendersons." I set the phone down and breathed. The hook had landed. Let them wait. I sipped tea while Maya adjusted a small bouquet on the counter and said this was working, that we would keep our timing and not be rushed by anyone else's clock. I nodded because the only way this day would belong to me was if I guarded it from the first minute to the last. The phone buzzed again. My mother had posted on Facebook 2 milestones in one day, so proud to celebrate Brianna and Derek's 5-year anniversary and Grace and Ethan's wedding at Rosewood. Photos rolled in under her words, smiling faces at round tables, a chandelier casting bright spangles, a backdrop of trimmed hedges. 200 guests, she had said, and from the stream of comments I could tell she had not been exaggerating. I scrolled for only a moment, feeling no guilt, then turned the screen face down. That room was built to trap me. It could not catch me if I refused to walk through the door. Ethan came in with a plate for me and set it down, then touched my shoulder in that way that says I am here without asking for anything back. We did not talk about Rosewood. We talked about the vows we would speak by the lake, and the people who would stand with us, 20 friends and family who knew how to love without keeping score. After a while, I stood and went to get my hair and makeup done in the small guest room that looked out over the water. I took a second photo at the mirror, hair mostly finished, makeup next. A smile, slightly tilted, and sent another text. About 30 minutes behind. Almost ready. Hearts and confetti came from relatives I barely knew, along with a tight line from my mother. People are asking, the minister is waiting. Please hurry. And then, Brianna, this is inconsiderate. My anniversary is at risk. I silenced the thread and set the phone aside. The lake wind brushed the trees, and the house breathed with the soft sounds of friends doing quiet work. Calm rose up in me like tide water. Across town, the ballroom swelled. The hired host cleared his throat and began with the script my mother and Brianna had handed him. Their words filling a microphone I had chosen not to touch. He praised 5 years of marriage. He spoke of Brianna's journey. He invited applause that rolled around the room like a well-rehearsed wave. Somewhere near the end of the page, he mentioned me, a pleasant note about the joy of sharing a day, then moved on to the schedule that placed her centre stage. People clapped, but some craned their necks curious, waiting for the bride who did not appear. From what Jessica texted later, the whispers started to coil through the tables first, about hair delays, then about traffic, then about the way the flowers looked like they belonged to a different party. Brianna paced in the wings, snapping at a server who set down glasses a little too loudly, while my mother stood by the door rehearsing lines about minor delays in a voice that still hoped to bend the room to her will. My father checked his watch again and again, a small crease deepening between his eyes. They were doing what they always did, smoothing, insisting, selling a story. Only this time, the person required to make the story work was not there. Back at the lake house, Maya fastened the tiny row of buttons on my dress while I breathed slow and steady. The lace lay close to my skin, light and soft, no heavy beading, no train to trip me. I looked at my reflection, at the clean line of my hair, at the way my shoulders sat without that old tension. I could feel the quiet settle, not a silence that waits for orders, but the kind that comes when you finally choose yourself. I lifted the phone one last time and took a photo of the dress from the waist up, the kind that gives away nothing. I typed a line, almost ready, finishing touches, 30 more minutes, and sent it. Then I turned the phone off and placed it in a drawer. No more responding to a room I had never asked for. No more letting their clock wind mine. I walked to the door and found Ethan waiting in his suit, the one we had chosen for its ease, not for anyone else's approval. He looked at me, the way he always does, as if I were something rare and clear. He asked if I felt ready. I told him I did. I told him that for once they were waiting on me, and I was not coming. We stepped onto the deck where the lake lay wide and steady, where friends were tying white ribbons to the birch trees, and Ethan's parents were setting out plates and glasses, simple and bright. I could almost see the ballroom in my mind, as if I were looking at a photograph. The host shuffling note cards, the guests shifting in their chairs, the cake sweating under the lights, my mother soothing my father, bargaining my sister, rehearsing her smile like a shield. But that stage was theirs, and it would collapse without me. The day I wanted, the day I chose, was here in the quiet, and every delay text I had sent had been a small act of mercy for myself, a way to hold the space I needed until it could not be taken from me. I took Ethan's hand and felt the answer of his fingers folding into mine. Control did not feel like power in that moment. It felt like peace. It felt like finally remembering my own name. I held that feeling as Ethan and I walked the short path to the lakeside chapel, the water calm and bright beside us, white ribbons moving softly in the trees. 20 people waited under the shade, the faces that had stood by us through hard years and small joys, no one here to judge or to take, only to witness. Maya squeezed my hand and stepped back. Ethan's mother straightened a wildflower jar on the first row. Ethan's father stood at the front, with a small book, his eyes warm and a little wet, the kind of welcome that asks nothing in return. The music was only the water and the wind. We took our places, and for a long breath, I simply looked at the people I loved and let the quiet do its work. Ethan's father spoke first not as a performer, but as a man who had raised a son and now welcomed a daughter. He talked about building a life in small, daily ways, not in grand displays, and he said we were here for vows that would be kept in kitchens and living rooms and at late-night tables when fear visited, because love is shown in how we stay. He smiled at me and asked if I was ready. I was. I took Ethan's hands and felt the sure weight of his grip, steady and warm. When it was my turn to speak, I did not try to be poetic. I said, I am choosing to be me, not their version of me, not a role written by someone else. Me. I choose you because with you I can be myself and still be cared for. I choose a life that is honest and kind. I choose to be your partner in everything. Ethan nodded, and his smile broke into a laugh that carried across the water. He promised to stand with me and to listen to protect the space where our truth lives and to be my safe place when the world turned loud. There were tears and there was laughter, and when Ethan's father pronounced us husband and wife, the cheers were soft and close, the kind that warm a room instead of shaking it. We walked back down the path through a drift of petals, and I felt lighter than I had in years. I could not help but think of the other room across town, the one so heavy with plans that had left no space for us. Jessica sent a short message from a friend of a friend who had taken a peek inside. The 5-tier cake stood under lights untouched. The champagne tower waited, shining, but still. The host had spoken for too long, while people checked their watches and asked each other who the day belonged to. Whispers moved from table to table, some about traffic, some about hair, some about the strange way everything seemed to point to Brianna, while the bride was missing. Brianna paced behind a curtain, and my mother smoothed her dress and whispered excuses to anyone who would listen. My father kept stepping out to call someone, and then back in to pretend nothing was wrong. I read the words and then put the phone away. Not my stage, not my burden. Back at the lake house, Ethan's mother set out plates of simple food, and the room filled with easy talk and warm toasts. Someone started a small playlist on a speaker, and we danced not in practice steps, but in the kind of movement that happens when people feel safe. The sunlight moved slowly across the floor, and I leaned against the railing with my head on Ethan's shoulder. He asked if I felt good. I said I felt like myself, which was better than good. He kissed my temple and said, "Welcome home." Mrs. Evelyn from next door hugged me and said she had not seen me breathe like this since the day she met me, and I believed her. Maya lifted a glass and said to small vows that carry great weight, and everyone laughed and raised their glasses too. For a moment, I watched the light touch the lake and thought how this was all I had ever really wanted. A room where no one asked me to be smaller, a promise spoken without fear that someone would use it against me. The contrast settled in without bitterness, only clarity. At Rosewood, money had bought a hall and a menu and a program, but it could not buy truth. Here, where the wood smelled of pine and the flowers came from a backyard, we had everything we needed. Later, Ethan and I stepped outside with our plates and sat on the steps. The air felt clean. I told him I was grateful for every person who had chosen to stand with us, and grateful for the ones who had stayed away without knowing they had given me a gift. He nodded and said, "This is what a family is. People who do not make you pay to be loved." I let the words sink in and felt the last bits of fear loosen their hold. We cut a small cake, nothing towering, nothing fragile under heat, just sweet and simple, and fed each other a bite while our friends clapped and laughed. The joy that filled me did not need proof or applause. It simply was. As the sun slid lower, the water turned soft gold and the birch leaves flickered like quiet lights, and I knew that what we had built here would last longer than any show of grandeur. When Ethan took my hand and we walked back inside to more hugs and more soft music, I understood the shape of our life had begun in the right place with truth and with peace, and I would carry that with me into whatever came next. For years, they had spoken over me about me deciding for me, but now their only voice that mattered was the one printed in ink, and it spoke the truth they could no longer deny. That thought lingered in me as the news from Rosewood began to reach the lake house, in pieces carried by texts from Jessica, and whispers through friends who had stayed behind to watch the show unravel. I had imagined what it might look like, but the reality was sharper. The manager had approached my parents with the invoice $63,000, his tone polite but firm. Their signatures alone sat on the contract mine, absent except for the small deposit I had agreed to. My mother had stammered, saying the bride was responsible that I had promised, but he pointed to the line where her name and my father's name stood side by side in clear ink. Guests noticed their faces drain of colour. Some asked quiet questions. The lies began to shake. I was told my father's voice grew loud as he tried to argue, saying I had always paid that, of course, I would pay again. The manager did not raise his voice. He only repeated that the bride was not on the contract, and the bill belonged to those who had signed. My father had no answer to that. My mother tried to soothe, to charm, to stretch her smile wider, but no one leaned closer this time. Brianna tried to distract, telling people that the ceremony was delayed because of me, but her husband Derek overheard enough to press her. He asked her what she had done to me. His voice was not soft, it was sharp, the way a person sounds when a truth begins to break through denial. She insisted it was nothing that I had agreed, that I was dramatic. But Derek kept asking, and this time her words did not land. People nearby watched the cracks form. Jessica's text buzzed on my phone. She wrote, "Your mom is crying. Your dad is shouting. Brianna's husband is furious. The guests are leaving." I read the words and set the phone down, feeling something I had waited for all my life. Vindication. The bill spoke louder than any of my protests ever had. I whispered to Ethan, "The bill finally speaks," and he understood without needing me to explain. He wrapped his arm around me and I leaned into him, letting the weight of years roll off in small pieces. Back at Rosewood, the 5-tier cake stood untouched. The champagne tower glittered, but never poured. Guests whispered more openly now, their eyes sliding toward my parents with judgment. A few slipped out coats over arms, shaking their heads. My father's face turned red with strain as he argued with the manager, but the papers remained firm, heavy as stone. My mother sat down, finally, mascara streaking her cheeks, her voice broken. Brianna tried to reclaim the spotlight, insisting it was still her anniversary celebration, but no one clapped. Derek's face was pale, his jaw tight as he watched her, and for the first time I believe he saw her clearly. At the lake house, the sun was beginning to set, turning the water soft and gold. Our friends laughed and clinked glasses, children ran across the grass, and I felt a peace so different from the frantic spectacle across town. For years I had been their safety net, the one they dropped responsibility onto without hesitation, and I had carried it, breaking under its weight. But not now. Now The net had slipped from under them, and they were left to face the ground themselves. I thought of my father promising me once that family comes first, but only when it meant I had to give. I thought of my mother telling me to keep the peace, even if it meant losing myself. I thought of Brianna's laughter, sharp and cutting, certain that I would always carry her weight, and I thought of the manager's calm voice, the way he said the bride is not on this contract, as if he were the only one in that room who had ever seen me clearly. As the night deepened, I held Ethan's hand and felt only steadiness. They could rage, they could scramble for excuses, they could watch the guests drift away. None of it belonged to me anymore. For the first time, the cost of their choices was theirs alone. For the first time, their silence was not my burden to carry, but my victory to claim. I held on to that thought as the morning light filled our living room. I was still in my robe, coffee cooling in my hands, when the knock came at the door. Not gentle, not uncertain, but sharp and heavy, the kind of knock that expects obedience. Ethan glanced at me and I nodded. We both knew who it was. I opened the door to find my parents, Brianna and a man in a stiff suit standing together. My mother's eyes were swollen and red, my father's jaw locked tight. Brianna looked both furious and triumphant, and the man carried a leather briefcase. They pushed past me before I could say a word, the air in our small space turning heavy with their presence. My mother's voice broke first. "How could you do this to us after everything we gave you?" She sat on the couch like a mourner at a funeral. My father set a folder on the table with a thud. His voice was flat cold. "We have proof, Naomi. You signed an authorization to cover all wedding expenses." The lawyer opened the folder and slid a page toward me. There, it was my name, written in a script that looked enough like mine to be convincing, stamped with a date I never touched. My stomach twisted. My breath caught. For a moment, I believed it. For a moment, the old fear gripped me. The one that said, no matter what I did, they would find a way to trap me again. My hand shook as I touched the page. I whispered that maybe I had lost. Maybe my plan had collapsed. Brianna leaned forward, her smile sharp, saying, "I told you she would come around. You never win against family." But before I could sink further, Sarah stepped forward. Calm, steady. She reached into her bag and pressed play on her phone. The room filled with my father's voice slurred with drink recorded weeks ago at a family gathering. He laughed, boasting, "She will never sue us, she never dares." The words echoed in the air like a gavel striking. The lawyer's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing thin. He looked at my parents and asked if they had been truthful with him. No one answered. The forged signature lay limp on the table, its power collapsing in an instant. My father's face went pale. My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came. I drew in a long breath and steadied myself. Then I reached for the folder I had prepared, the one filled with every piece of evidence I had collected. Vendor emails where my parents had written that Naomi would pay. Bank statements showing charges I never made. The note I had sent to the venue manager clearly stating my $6,000 deposit was my only commitment. I laid them out one by one on the table, each page a stone in the foundation of my truth. "This is my limit," I said quietly. Nothing more. The room fell silent except for the sound of paper shifting. My mother trembled. My father stared at the floor. Brianna looked around as if someone might rescue her. I let the moment breathe. Then I reached into another folder and pulled out a photocopy of the contract. The real one was safe in Sarah's files, but this one was mine to use. I walked to the side table where a small candle flickered. My hands no longer shook. I held the paper above the flame and watched as the edge caught curling into black. My voice was steady as I spoke. You ruined my college years. You are not ruining my wedding day. Consider the $63,000 your investment in my freedom. The paper burned down in my hand, the ashes falling into the dish. I looked at them, then back at my family. None of them spoke. None of them moved. For years, they had filled every silence with commands, with laughter at my expense, with demands for more. But now, in this silence, I held the power. The lawyer gathered his papers quickly, shaking his head as he stood. I will not be party to this, he muttered and walked out. My mother's sobs grew louder. My father's fist clenched at his sides. Brianna sputtered, but no words came. Ethan stepped closer, his presence solid at my back, and Sarah folded her arms, her calm gaze fixed on them. I stood taller than I ever had in front of them. Their silence was no longer my burden. It was my victory. When the door closed behind them, the room felt wider, as if the walls had stepped back to make space for air. The dish on the table held a thin grey curl of ash. I rinsed it away and dried my hands. Then I sat down with Ethan and Sarah and opened my laptop. I knew what had to happen next. No more whispers, no more private fixes that could be twisted later. I had to bring everything into the light and leave it there. I began to write. I started with the truth in plain words. I told my aunts and uncles and cousins that Ethan and I were married by the lake with 20 people we loved, that the day had been quiet and kind, and that I was grateful. I wrote that the party at Rosewood was not my wedding, and that the bill for it did not belong to me. I named who had planned it and who had signed the contract. I attached the vendor emails where my parents had written that I would pay after contracts were signed. I attached the message where I had drawn my line and confirmed my deposit as my only commitment. I attached the bank statements that showed charges made without my consent, including the second dress. I read it all again, checked the names, checked the dates, and then I pressed send. My hands shook when I set the laptop down, but it was not fear, it was release. For years I had carried their version of events like a weight. Now the truth could stand on its own legs. Sarah stayed while I waited for replies, her calm presence a kind of anchor. The first messages came quickly. Some were simple notes of blessing. Some were quiet shock and promises to call later. One cousin wrote that she had always felt there was something wrong in the way things were handled, and she was sorry she had stayed silent. I wrote back to each of them in short lines. No anger, no drama, only facts and thanks. Then the bank called. I put it on speaker so Sarah could hear. The agent confirmed that my dispute had been logged and that the charges in question were now under investigation. While the process moved forward, I would not be held liable. The agent spoke gently, matter of fact. I thanked her, and when the call ended, I felt a knot in my chest come loose. The house seemed quieter, the air seemed easier to move through. A few minutes later, an email from Rosewood arrived. The manager wrote that after reviewing the paperwork and the correspondence liability rested entirely with the signers of the contract, namely Linda Miller and James Miller. He confirmed that my payment was a deposit only, and that no further claim would be made against me. I forwarded the email to my parents and to Brianna. I also sent it to Derek. I did not add any message. The subject line said all it needed to say. The replies came unevenly through the day. A few relatives tried to comfort my mother in their notes to me. I thanked them and said I wished her well. I did not add more. Later, a message arrived from a number I did not have short and careful. It was Derek. He thanked me for sending the message and said he was sorry for what had happened. He wrote that he had asked Brianna to start therapy and that he would not stay married to a lie. I put the phone down and let out a long breath. I did not feel triumph in that moment. I felt a clean sadness, for what should have been and was not. I also felt a small hope that maybe the harm would not keep repeating in the next generation. By evening, the house was full of a different kind of quiet, not the kind that waits for the next blow, but the kind that settles after a long storm. Ethan cooked something simple, and we ate at the table where the ash had been our plates, clean and bright. I told him about the messages I had received and read him the one from Derek. He listened and said he was proud of me, not for winning, but for choosing the light. He said that was the part of this day he would remember. I believed him. I also believed that none of this would have worked without the law holding steady on the other end. I wrote a thank you to the agent at the bank who had handled my call, and another to the manager at Rosewood. I wanted records of gratitude too, not only of harm. When the next day came, more facts arrived. A relative told me in a careful message that my father had begun the process of drawing from his retirement account to pay the bill. Another said my mother had stopped taking calls. I read the words without heat. I thought of all the years I had been asked to carry the cost of their choices because they claimed to be protecting the family. Now they had to protect themselves, and the protection looked like paying what they owed. I did not gloat. I did not need to. It was enough to sit in a room that finally felt safe, and to know that truth and paper had done what my shaking voice could not do for so long. Late that afternoon, I drafted one more message, this one to my parents. I kept it short. I said I wished them health. I said I would no longer take calls that pressured or blamed or asked for money. I said if they wanted to speak when they were ready to take responsibility for their actions, I would listen for a few minutes and then let them go. I hit send and turned off my phone for an hour. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was full of a new kind of strength. Sarah came by with a file folder and we went over everything one more time. She showed me the timeline she had prepared in case anything new appeared. I felt my lungs fill all the way as she spoke. For the first time since I'd overheard them in the dining room, I was not bracing for impact. I was standing. That night, as the light faded, we took a walk around the block. The air was warm and the sky thin and pale. Ethan reached for my hand the way he always does not, because I needed help, but because he likes to be connected. I told him I felt relief in layers. The first layer was knowing they could not twist the story anymore. The second was knowing that institutions had sided with facts and not with names. The third was smaller and softer. It was the layer that said I did not have to prove myself in every room. I could let papers speak when my heart was tired. When we got back, I checked my inbox one last time. Aunts had replied. Cousins had asked to see photos from the lake. I sent a few. Us laughing light through the trees, a cake the size of 2 hands, my short hair bright against a white dress with no weight to it. I wrote that I was happy, and that I hoped to see them soon under kinder circumstances. Then, I shut the computer and folded a blanket over the back of the couch. The house felt like a place that belonged to me again. I stood there for a while, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faraway sound of a siren on another street, and I thought about what it means to be clear. Clarity does not fix every wound, but it keeps new wounds from forming. It keeps the hands of other people out of your pockets and off your name. It lets you walk into the next day without dragging the last day behind you. I looked at Ethan and smiled. He said what? I said nothing you need to fix. He laughed and pulled me close. In the days that followed, the story settled. There were no more announcements online. There were no more plans made in my name. There were only the steady facts of ordinary life. Work, meals, friends. The small quiet of a morning coffee that stays warm long enough to finish it. And beneath it all, a steady line of relief I could touch when I needed to. For the first time, the truth belonged to me. and in the clear light of day, it could not be twisted or taken away. Today, the house smelled of turkey and cinnamon sunlight, spilling through the wide windows onto the hardwood floors Ethan and I had stained with our own hands last spring. I placed the last crimson and gold chrysanthemums into the centerpiece and stepped back, smiling at how simple and bright the table looked. On the mantel above the fireplace stood our lakeside wedding photo, the one where we were both laughing and not looking at the camera, our joy unposed and real. It was the first thing I had unpacked when we moved in. A reminder that this house, this life, had begun with a choice I had made for myself. Our friends and cousins began to arrive, arms full of pies and bottles of wine, their greetings warm and easy. There was no tension at this gathering, no hidden bargains waiting at the edges of the meal. Laughter filled the room even before the food touched the table. As I carried extra chairs from the hallway, I felt a swell of gratitude. This was the family I had chosen, the one that did not demand my sacrifice as proof of love. Over the past year, I had learned what peace felt like in ordinary moments. Morning coffee that stayed hot long enough to finish it. Evenings when Ethan and I planned our garden instead of bracing for the next call from my parents. And the best part, knowing the savings we had protected from the Rosewood disaster had gone to start a small scholarship fund. 2 young women had begun college this fall because of it. I thought often of the day they sent us their thank you notes, simple words written in careful handwriting, and I felt something settle in me, the sense that even broken things could be reshaped into something good. The doorbell rang again, and when I opened it, Brianna stood there alone. Her shoulders were slumped against the cold, her face pale, her eyes rimmed red, but not from anger. She held no folder, no demands, only herself. She whispered, "I came to apologize, really apologize." For a long moment, I studied her, waiting for the familiar sharpness, the rehearsed performance. But it was not there. Instead, I saw something new, or maybe something old that had been buried humility. I stepped aside and let her in, but I did not lower my guard. I said, "You are still my sister, but respect is required if you want to stay in my life." She nodded quickly, as if the words were both expected and accepted. That was enough for now. Dinner was lively. People passed dishes back and forth, conversations overlapping, laughter spilling into every corner. Brianna sat quietly answering when spoken to, but not pushing herself into the centre. It felt strange, but not unwelcome. As I looked around the table, I saw no battles being fought, only food being shared. That was all I had ever wanted from family, the chance to sit together without fear. After the meal, Ethan disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a small box wrapped in silver paper. He placed it in my hands with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I unwrapped it slowly, and inside was a shadow box with our framed $6,000 deposit receipt mounted against burgundy velvet. The inscription at the bottom read, "The best investment in our freedom." My breath caught. I traced the glass with my fingertips and felt tears welling in my eyes. That number, once a symbol of anger and loss, now stood as proof of what we had gained. Freedom, dignity, a life that belonged to us. I looked around the room again. Friends leaning back in chairs, glasses raised in casual toasts, Brianna quietly helping clear plates. Ethan watching me with the steady affection that had carried me through every storm. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, calm and full. My life was not perfect, but it was honest. It was mine, and that was enough. 1 year, 1 home. The walls held laughter instead of demands, and the photo on the mantel held a truth no one could twist. I breathed in the scent of chrysanthemums and roasted turkey, and thought this is what family is meant to feel like. Chosen, steady, and safe. And as I sit with that thought, I realize the story is not only mine. Many of us carry wounds from people who should have loved us most, and the hardest part is learning that love without respect is not real love at all. Maybe you have been asked to carry a burden that was never yours. Maybe you have been told that keeping the peace meant giving up your own voice. If that is you, I want you to know you are not alone. Healing is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is as quiet as writing down your truth so you can see it clearly on paper. Sometimes it is talking with a friend who listens without judgment. Sometimes it is reaching out for therapy or joining a group where others have walked the same road. Some people heal by creating art, some by walking in nature, some by starting a new tradition that feels true to who they are. There is no one way, only the steady reminder that you are allowed to choose a life that does not hurt you. I learned that boundaries are not walls to keep people out. They are doors you can open or close depending on how others treat you. And when you stand firm, the people who truly care will find a way to meet you with respect. The ones who do not, their silence is not your loss. It is your freedom. As you go back into your own life, I hope you remember this. You deserve peace. You deserve love that does not cost your dignity. You deserve to build a home, even if that home is just a small space in your heart where you are safe and seen. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening, for letting this story be part of your day. If it touched something inside you, I invite you to stay connected, to follow along for more stories that remind us we are not alone. No pressure, only an open hand. Because sometimes all we need is one steady voice telling us we can begin again.